Let me begin with something most people do not want to hear because it sounds too plain to be powerful. The people who end up financially free are usually not the people who made the most brilliant move. They are the people who learned how to hold onto a gap. That is the image I want in your head. A gap, not a chart, not a miracle stock, not some glamorous trade that lets you tell a better story at dinner. A gap, the distance between what comes in and what goes out. That gap looks small when you first notice it. Sometimes insultingly small, a few $100s, maybe less, sometimes a little more. It does not feel like wealth. It does not feel impressive. It does not feel worthy of the kinds of dreams people carry around in their heads when they think about security, retirement, or freedom. And that is why so many people lose the game before they even understand what game they were playing. They think wealth begins with abundance. It does not. Wealth begins with a protected gap. I have watched people earn excellent incomes and still arrive late in life anxious, dependent, and disappointed. Because every time the gap opened, they rushed to fill it with a nicer lifestyle. A raise came in and the car got bigger. A bonus arrived and the vacation got upgraded. A new job landed and the rent quietly followed. Each improvement felt deserved. I understand that. Human beings want to feel the reward of their effort while it is still warm. There is nothing mysterious about that. But the future does not care what felt deserved. The future only asks one question. What did you keep? That is the whole thing. Not what you earned. Not what you said you valued. Not what you intended to build. What did you keep and what did you do with what you kept? If you really understand that, almost all serious money wisdom fits inside it, because wealth is not built by motion. It is built by retained force. It is built by holding back enough of the river so that over time the pressure becomes useful. That is why I want you to think about money as a reservoir. A reservoir is not exciting when it begins. It is mud, concrete, patience, and a lot of people who look unremarkable while the wall is still low. But once the wall holds and the water accumulates, the same reservoir can irrigate fields, power cities, protect against drought, and change the future of everyone downstream. That is what your first real savings gap becomes if you respect it long enough. It stops being spare cash, it becomes stored power. The trouble is that most people never build the wall, or they build part of it, then blow holes through it the moment life becomes emotional. That is why I do not think personal finance begins with investing, it begins with containment. A person who cannot contain the flow cannot compound it, and a person who cannot compound cannot become free in any serious sense. This is the first rule, though I would not call it a rule so much as the first physical law of the whole system. Spend less than you earn. Always. Not because poverty theater is noble, not because sacrifice is a religion, not because you should live like a monk while pretending that joy is morally suspect. Number, because without a gap there is no reservoir. And without a reservoir, all the rest of the conversation is just financial decoration. You can talk about the market, you can talk about index funds, you can talk about compounding, retirement, tax efficiency, sector allocation, real estate, and all the other words that make people feel financially literate. But if the gap is not there, the machine has no fuel. That is the part people try to skip. They want the high-level conversation before they have honored the first law. They want wealth without pressure. It does not work that way. Now, once the gap exists, the second law arrives immediately. Do not wait. I have never met a person who regretted starting early. I have met many who regretted waiting for a cleaner mood, a larger income, a calmer market, a better time, a more confident self, a number in the bank that would finally make them feel ready. Read that last sentence carefully, because it is where a great many lives quietly bend in the wrong direction. People think readiness is a feeling. It is not. Readiness is a decision made before the feeling arrives. That is why the second thing I want you to understand is that time is not a side factor in wealth. Time is the main engine. You can argue with markets, you can argue with politics, you can argue with inflation, taxes, cycles, fear, and all the bad behavior of institutions and individuals. You cannot argue with time. If you give compounding enough of it, it becomes unfair in your favor. If you deny it, no level of intelligence later will fully repair what you refuse to let begin. That is why a person who starts with $500 a month at 25 is not merely being responsible. He is buying a structural advantage over the person who waits until 35 to behave with exactly the same intelligence and exactly the same consistency. The late starter is not punished because he is immoral. He is punished because mathematics is unsentimental. Mathematics does not care whether you had good reasons. It only counts what was in motion and for how long. That is why the early years matter so much. Not because the balances are dramatic. They are not. They are often almost insulting in how small they look relative to the self-restraint that produced them. That is another thing. No one says honestly enough the beginning is demoralizing if you expected emotional fireworks. The first years of saving and investing are mostly you doing the heavy lifting while the account gives you almost no visible reason to feel powerful. The gains are polite. The deposits are doing all the work. You feel like the engine because you are the engine. And that is why many people abandon the plan. They mistake the slow early phase for evidence that the method is weak. It is not weak. It is just early stages in any compounding process feel underwhelming. That is not a flaw. That is physics. A snowball is not majestic when it is the size of a fist. A reservoir is not impressive when the wall is new and the waterline still low. A business is not awe-inspiring when only the founder believes in it. But all of those things can become massive if the structure holds long enough. That is how time works. Not dramatically at first, then all at once in hindsight. So, if I were speaking to a young person or to someone older who feels ashamed for having waited too long, I would tell them the same thing. Start now with what you have, not with what you wish you had, not with the number that would make the story sound nicer, with what you have. Because money in motion learns a language that idle intention never learns, and because the market does not require perfection at the door, it requires continuity. If all wealth required were a savings gap and enough time, this would already be difficult, but it would not be emotionally brutal. The emotional brutality enters in the third phase, when the market reminds you it is not a straight line. This is where grown adults, who can endure long work weeks, difficult bosses, family stress, and real life in all its untidiness, suddenly behave like frightened children. A market drawdown reveals something almost no one likes admitting. Most people do not simply want returns. They want reassurance. They want to believe that the account will go up in a way that flatters their nervous system. They want the future to be green, orderly, and legible. They want investing to feel like reward rather than turbulence. That is not what markets are. Markets are transfer systems run through fear. The person who becomes wealthy through them does not become someone who enjoys fear. He becomes someone who stops obeying fear at the worst moments. That is a very different skill. I have watched this enough times that I no longer see crashes mainly as financial events. I see them as loyalty tests. In 2008, millions of people discovered that what they had called a long-term plan was actually a fair-weather plan. They had loved the market as long as it behaved like a helpful machine and hated it the moment it behaved like a clearing mechanism. They sold when they were most frightened. They moved into cash when the pain was freshest. Then they waited for peace, which always arrives after the repricing, never before it. That is how permanent loss gets created, not by volatility itself, by fear acting inside volatility. This is why one of the deepest rules of money is that the market will at some point terrify you, and your job is not to stop it from terrifying you. Your job is to stop terror from becoming a command. That is a subtle but enormous difference. Most people think self-mastery in finance means becoming emotionless nonsense. You will feel the fear, everyone does. The question is whether the fear gets a vote. That is why systems matter more than moods. Automatic contributions matter. Written plans matter. A spouse or friend who understands the long view matters. Distance from constant, quote, checking matters. Because in the middle of a drawdown, your instincts are not allies. Your instincts were built to get you away from loss, not to optimize a 40-year compounding plan. The same circuitry that helped your ancestors survive danger can destroy your wealth if it becomes your portfolio manager. This is why I like to say that the market does not mainly test intelligence. It tests temperament. And temperament is often protected by systems more reliably than by insight. This is also why I distrust the cult of cleverness in investing. There is a peculiar kind of man who wants to make money only if the method allows him to feel exceptional. He wants the perfect stock, the hidden opportunity, the timing edge, the complexity that proves he sees what the crowd cannot. Maybe sometimes he does. More often, he simply confuses activity with superiority. I have seen countless Davids like this, smart, hungry, curious, financially literate enough to sound serious, but emotionally addicted to the feeling of doing something. They research obsessively. They trade frequently. They watch earnings calls, news cycles, analyst revisions, market rotations, and all the other shiny machinery that makes them feel close to the source of power. And after 5 or 10 years, if they ever honestly compare themselves to a dull person who simply bought the broad market at low cost and kept adding to it through good years and bad, they discover something humiliating. The boring investor often wins, not because he was less capable, because he was less self-destructive. That is one of the hardest truths for the intelligent to accept. Complexity is not sophistication. Activity is not mastery. Friction eats return. Taxes eat return. Ego eats return. The more often a person needs to express intelligence through his portfolio, the more likely he is to injure the very thing he claims to be building. I do not say this to attack curiosity. Curiosity is a gift. I say it to remind you that wealth usually responds to simplicity better than vanity. Buy good productive assets or a broad market proxy, add consistently. Do not interrupt compounding unless the underlying facts truly changed. That is not sexy enough for the financial industry, because the financial industry earns more by keeping you emotionally stimulated than by making you peacefully rich. A peaceful investor is not very profitable to many intermediaries. He buys, holds, waits, and thinks in decades. He is terrible for chatter and excellent for compounding. That is the fourth law of wealth. Do not mistake motion for progress. Now, there is another enemy of wealth even more efficient than bad investing. Debt. I want to be very careful here, because language about debt is often too moral and not mechanical enough. Some debt can support asset acquisition. Some debt can accelerate productive ownership. Fine, I am not talking about all debt as though it were one thing. I am talking about high-interest consumer debt that feeds on your future. Credit cards in particular are one of the most efficient extraction devices ever built for ordinary households. They do not destroy people in dramatic fashion most of the time. They do something worse. They normalize a quiet bleed, 18%, 20%, 25%, each month, each revolving balance. A little piece of your future gets sold to your past choices. There is no investment strategy I trust enough to tell a regular person to ignore that. If you are paying those rates, that debt is the fire, not an annoyance, not a side issue. The fire, a person who carries 20-plus% debt while talking grandly about market returns, is usually doing arithmetic theater. He is playing a hopeful story against a brutal guaranteed cost, and the cost is winning before the market even gets a turn. This is why one of the highest return actions available to a lot of people is not finding a better stock. It is extinguishing the debt that is already compounding against them. People dislike hearing this because it feels unglamorous, and because people emotionally prefer building wealth to repairing leakage. I understand that the ego likes construction more than repair, but mathematics does not flatter ego. If you are losing 20% in one corner of the machine, you do not solve that by chasing 7 or 8% in another while smiling about discipline. You solve the fire first, that is the adult answer, which leads to something equally boring and equally powerful. The emergency fund. I have noticed that people misunderstand emergency cash because they imagine its purpose is to sit there looking cowardly while more exciting assets do the real work. The emergency fund is not there to be impressive. It is there to keep ordinary chaos from infecting your long-term machine. A broken transmission, a lost job, a bad roof, a medical bill, a family emergency. Life is full of events that do not care whether the market is down 30% at the exact moment they arrive. Without cash, those events force terrible timing on you. They make you borrow expensively or liquidate productive assets when they are temporarily cheap. That is the part people miss. The emergency fund is not mainly about the emergency. It is about protecting the investment plan from the emergency. It is a moat around your compounding. That is why I prefer a fortress to an empire in the early years. Get the walls up. Liquidity. No or low predatory debt. Some insulation from ordinary misfortune, then build, not because caution is noble, because fragility is expensive. This is one of the reasons so many people who know what to do still fail to do it. They start building the empire on top of a floor that cannot tolerate disturbance. Then life, as life always does, disturbs them, and the whole thing shakes loose. That is not fate. That is sequencing. A man with no emergency fund and a large risk portfolio is not bold. He is exposed. A man with a modest but real cash reserve, low interest obligations, and an automatic investing system is not boring. He is durable. Durability matters much more than style. Now, wealth would still be difficult if all it required were some arithmetic, an emergency buffer, low debt, consistent investing, and patience. But there is one more thing most people skip, and when they skip it, the whole process starts to feel punitive. Purpose money without purpose becomes a sterile number game. You can save in a technically correct way and still feel resentful if you have no honest relationship to what the money is for. People endure sacrifice more intelligently when they know what they are buying with it. Not in the market in life, time with children, the ability to walk away from degrading work, a retirement that is not built on fear, a paid for education for the next generation, the ability to give, the ability to rest, the ability to choose. That is what purpose does. It turns discipline from punishment into exchange. The person with no why experiences every unbought thing as a deprivation. The person with a real why experiences many of those same moments as direction. This is not soft language. It is practical. When the market falls, purpose keeps you in your seat. When spending temptations arrive, purpose gives the no meaning. When progress feels too slow, purpose keeps the machine from becoming emotionally dead. This is why I tell people to write down what the money is for in plain language with embarrassing specificity if necessary. Not financial security. That is abstract enough to disappear on contact. Say what you mean. I want the option to leave work by 60. I want my children to begin adulthood without student debt. I want 6 years of life at the end where my body is still strong enough to enjoy the freedom I bought. Those are living statements. They can compete with impulse. Most numbers cannot. And now we come to something I want to say very clearly to the people who feel late. The worst use of financial truth is self-torment. A man in his 40s, 50s, or 60s can learn about compounding and turn education into grief. Almost instantly, He sees what earlier decades could have become and starts mourning an alternate timeline. I understand that feeling. It is useless. Pain about late discovery does not create a single additional dollar. The tree should have been planted earlier. Yes. But the second best moment remains now, and now is the only doorway that still exists. The principles do not expire because your timeline changed. They change shape. Maybe the amount needed each month may be higher. The urgency may be sharper. The asset mix may need more realism. The ego may need less fantasy, but the path remains the same path. Spend below income, create the gap, protect the gap, deploy the gap. Do not interrupt compounding. Kill predatory debt, build a moat, know your why. Think in decades, those things still work. They do not become false because the perfect window is gone. In fact, they become even more important because later starts cannot afford theatrical detours. This is why I have always respected progress over perfection. Perfectionism is one of the favorite costumes of avoidance. People say they want the whole plan before they move. They want the optimal tax structure, the perfect brokerage, the fully mapped asset allocation, the final philosophical certainty. The future laid out in a neat and reassuring way. Meanwhile, the month passes, then another. Then a year. Movement matters more than purity. A flawed good system beats a perfect imaginary one every time. And that brings me to the final law under everything else. Think in decades, not days. I do not mean this as a slogan. I mean it as a total nervous system retraining. We live in an age that allows you to check your financial future minute by minute. That is technological progress and psychological poison. At the same time, a person was not meant to watch his long-term goals fluctuate hourly without becoming tempted to interfere. The appetite for interference is why so many people never let compounding finish its work. If you buy a good business or a broad index and your time horizon is genuinely 10, 15, or 20 years, then many of the daily and even yearly movements are not information. They are noise. The modern mind struggles with this because noise is vivid and time is abstract. So the disciplined investor must deliberately reverse the emotional weighting. He must make the decade feel more real than the day. He must remember that his older self is the true client, not the nervous version of him glancing at his phone in a weak moment. He must keep bringing the conversation back to the only frame that gives his decisions meaning. Who will this help 10 years from now? Will this move make my future smaller or larger? That is how adults think. Not because adulthood is joyless, because adulthood understands sequence. One small decision is rarely dramatic. 1,000 small decisions in one direction become a life. That is, all wealth is at the personal level. Accumulated sequence, not genius, not luck. Not one perfect move. Sequence. That is why I said at the beginning that the whole thing begins with a gap. A gap becomes a reservoir, protected, invested, and left mostly alone becomes stored force. Stored force becomes optionality. Optionality becomes dignity. Dignity, if a person is wise enough to keep it, becomes a very different old age from the one most people drift into by accident. That is the whole conversation. And if you remember nothing else from me, remember this. The people who end up free are usually not the most dramatic people. They are the people who were willing to become boring in the right places for longer than everyone else around them. They let the machine work. They protected the gap. They refused to worship complexity. They killed the expensive leaks. They built a moat before the empire. They knew what the money was for. And they kept choosing the decade over the day until the result looked, from a distance, like talent. It was not talent. It was sequence. That is better news than talent, because sequence can begin with whoever is honest enough to start it. Even now, especially now,